Hello everyone, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I don't claim that my builds are the best in the game, and I'm sure there are better ways to optimize some of them, but be aware that I do tend to get my builds at least endgame viable. This includes things like arbitration, steel path, eidolon hunts, etc. Now that this is out of the way, these timestamps have been left here and in the description for your convenience. Feel free to skip around, but I'll start with the basics first just in case people don't know how to play this frame. Okay, so starting with the stats. So armor is 190 for a prime and 150 for a non-prime. You're looking at a 40-point increase going to the prime, which puts you at 38.8% damage reduction and 33.3% damage reduction, respectively. For energy, we have 150 for both. This puts you at 225 at max. For health, you're looking at 120 for prime, 100 for non-prime. A 20-point increase to the prime puts you at 360 and 300 for non-prime at max. For shield, you're looking at a stock 100 for both. This puts you at 300 at max. For sprint speed, you're looking at a pretty snappy 1.15. Regular Gara comes from Plains of Eidolon bounties, as well as the main blueprint from the Saya's Vigils quest. Gara Prime is unvaulted for the time being, so it shouldn't be an issue to pick up the Prime. Moving on to abilities, starting with the passive. A chance to create a radial blind lasting 10 seconds when exposed to bright light. So this can expose enemies to finishers, just like Excalibur's radial blind. The distance is 12 meters, and this passive is not affected by mods. Basically, this just stuns everything temporarily so they can't see, but they can still move around. Moving on to her first ability, Shattered Lash. Lash out with a stream of shattered glass or hold for an arcing strike. So there's two versions of this ability, which are essentially the same, but have a slight variation. So you tap to jab an enemy with puncture damage, or hold to swipe with slash damage. It has unlimited punch through up to its max range, and is affected by melee damage modifiers like Pressure Point, Combo Counter, and Arcane Fury. Casting this on her fourth ability gives some synergy, which I'll go into later. Drain is affected by ability efficiency, range is affected by ability range, while the radius is not, and damage is also further increased by ability strength. Okay, moving on to her second ability, Splinter Storm. Gara's armor splinters into a maelstrom of shattered glass. Allies who contact the cloud are fortified against damage. So basically, you actually have to cast this on the thing you want to take less damage. So if I cast this on myself, I'll get the damage reduction up to a 90% cap. If I cast it on an ally, they'll get the damage reduction. You can put this on multiple things at a time if you wanted to, so you can give multiple things damage reduction. Keep in mind, you can also put this on defense targets like excavators. It is worth noting, however, that the damage reduction is capped at 50% for defense targets. This can also be put on enemies to make them more vulnerable to damage. Additionally, when you go near an enemy, the shards deal damage to those enemies. The damage can be increased, as well as refreshing the duration through her other abilities, which I'll get into soon. Drain is affected by ability efficiency, cast range and radius are affected by ability range. Starting damage, damage reduction, and damage multiplier is affected by ability strength, and duration is of course affected by ability duration. Moving on to her third ability, Spectre Rage. Trap enemies in a carousel of mirrors, forcing them to attack visions of their true selves. Destroyed mirrors damage their attackers, as does the collapse of the carousel. Unfortunately, this ability is needlessly complicated for what it does, not to mention your fourth ability does everything it does, but better. So you cast it down, and within an unmentioned area around the ring, it entices enemies to walk in. I say unmentioned area around the ring because currently it does not say the charm radius in the tooltip, even though it is affected by range. In order to figure out the charm radius outside of the ring, you can cast it at your feet and put a marker at the center, then stand at the ring line, and whatever the marker says is roughly the range it will attract enemies from outside the ring. So in this example, it would be about 6 meters outside of the ring. The enemies that are inside the ring will then shoot at the mirrors. It's a decent crowd control, but in my opinion it takes too much range to achieve a super usable state, and your fourth can just freeze enemies anyway. In my personal opinion, this ability just falls off a bit too hard in high level content, but certainly does the job at low end stuff. When a mirror gets destroyed, it does damage to its attacker. When a certain amount of mirrors are broken, the entire ring collapses and does a set amount of damage to enemies inside the ring. This synergizes with the second ability because if you have it active while inside the ring, when a mirror breaks, it will add 50% of that damage to Splinter Storm. In my opinion, it is not worth using the ability for this, as your fourth ability gives your Splinter Storm a ton of damage compared to this. I'll go into that shortly. Drain is affected by ability efficiency, duration is affected by ability duration, number of mirrors is affected by ability range, and damage is affected by ability strength. This is also her subsumed ability when given to the Helminth. Moving on to her fourth ability, Mass Vitrify. Create an expanding ring of molten glass that slowly crystallizes enemies who enter. When the expansion is complete, the ring hardens to block weapons fire. The ring draws extra strength from the health and shields of crystallized enemies. Use Shattered Lash to smash the ring and send razor-sharp glass flying outward. So basically this makes a wall with a set amount of health, which gets more health depending on the enemies inside the cast area. Converted health and base health is affected by strength mods and armor mods. Frozen enemies take 1.5 times damage, which is affected by strength. Drain is affected by ability efficiency, while drain per second, max radius, and freeze duration is affected by ability duration. Range further increases max radius, as well as increasing explosion range. The explosion they talk about is the synergy with her first ability, so after casting, she can break her wall, which will cause an explosion around the outside of the wall, not on the inside. This is a pretty solid damage ability, as it scales off of your melee damage, as mentioned when I went over the first ability. Because of this, it can hit extremely hard. This is also the best way to stack damage on her second ability, so if you cast one on the wall while on the outside of the wall, you can stack your damage very, very easily. When you pair this with mods, it adds a ton of damage. Additionally, casting 4 will refresh the duration on your second ability, which means you can stack damage indefinitely. A quick tip for this ability is to cast it while in the air so you can make the wall taller. The height of the wall is just a bit taller than you, but the bottom of the wall goes pretty far into the ground, so it's worth casting in the air to have more coverage. Moving on to ability augments. So the first one we have is Mending Splinters. Splinter Storm augment. For each target affected, Splinter Storm heals 3 health per second. So the health per second is pretty low on this, but it is affected by strength at least, and excels when you have multiple targets affected by Splinter Storm. So for example, with 200% strength and 3 targets affected, it'll be healing for 18 health per second. It's not exactly the best source of healing, but for defending things that may not be otherwise healed, it's an okay option. For the next augment, we have Spectre Siphon, Spectre Rage augment. Enemies that die within Spectre Rage have a 50% chance to drop an energy orb. So this is pretty obvious. I mean, an enemy dies inside, they have a good chance at dropping an orb. This is pretty strong, but because you're typically killing things with your 4, which only kills on the exterior of the wall and not on the interior, it's kind of bad for Gara. Like, it can work, but frankly, this does actually work better on other frames in my opinion, so I don't use it. At this point in the video, I like to answer the question, is this frame still path viable? Can it run arbitrations? Is it part of the Eidolon hunts? Probably don't need it for the Eidolon hunts, but Gara is incredibly good in higher level content. Once her damage on her 2 gets rolling, she turns into an absolute blender even against armored steel path enemies. On lower level stuff or against unarmored enemies, her wall shatter alone will be a huge nuke. And being able to put damage reduction on defense targets and allies makes her great for just about everything. Moving on to the build. So for the first build, we have my Glass Guardian build. This is a mostly stationary defender build with high damage output. It utilizes Mending Splinters with high strength to make sure things are getting some passive healing. In terms of Helminth, you're going to want Dispensary. We use Blind Rage for the extra strength because we can. Because of the energy issues you're going to have, you'll need Dispensary and Equilibrium for this build. If you can't get Dispensary for this build, just skip to the next build. Because this is a more stationary defender, you may want to use a second build I have for things like Arbitration Defense where the target may run around. I use an Umbra Forma, but you can get away without one no problem. There's really no difference. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 5 Forma. You'll want 1 on the Aura. I recommend a Matter Eye or even an Aura Forma if you want to do other things. Additionally, you'll need to add 3 Naramin, one of which will replace a default Matter Eye and 1 Xeneric on the Exilis. Moving into the mods, starting with Aura, I chose Steel Charge over other things because this just gives you a lot of extra damage on your 4 whenever you break it. This also gives you a bunch more damage for your Splinter Storm stack, which is very important. As mentioned earlier, I use Blind Rage to push as much strength as possible, as well as Umbra Intensify. These just work really well together to bring up our strength to 258. There's no exact number that we're trying to hit here, but it does work really well at Mending Splinters. Next, we have Prime Continuity. We want as much duration as possible, so we don't, lose our 2 immediately. Prime Flow and Equilibrium go hand in hand together to give us a bunch of energy back. So Flow increases our max energy, and then Equilibrium allows us to convert health into energy with Dispensary. Next, we have Mending Splinters. This is just so we're getting some passive healing on everything that we have our 2 on. Stretch, just to not have base range, basically. That's really what it comes down to. And then we have Constitution to further increase our duration. This puts us at 40 seconds for our 2. In terms of Arcanes, you'll want Arcane Fury and either Arcane Guardian or Energize. Arcane Fury buffs your Vitrify explosion damage, which also gives your Splinter Storm more damage when stacking it this way. Guardian is a bit of an added tankiness if your shields drop, but Energize could also work here, however you shouldn't need it. Guardian is also good because it can give your wall extra health. In terms of misc requirements, just run something that can crit for Arcane Fury. you'll want a melee that has nothing but damage mods on it. This is going to be a total stat stick. Keep in mind there are some weapons that have syndicate augments that add a good amount of damage. Basically just stack as much damage mods as possible. And for the last slot you can run Corrupt Charge, which will get you more damage than a 90 mod. Just remember that if you stack Puncture or Slash, only do one or the other, as one part of your first ability does only Puncture and the other Slash, so you won't get bonus damage for both. Additionally, you'll need to run Synth Fiber on a companion to be able to pick up health orbs when at max health. This is where most of your energy comes from because of equilibrium, so this is not optional. In terms of Operator School, Xenoric for the initial energy is a good option, but Vazarin has super good additional utility for longer missions, so you can make targets invulnerable and have some instant revives. So I'm going to go over a quick how to use and then show some gameplay. Basically, when you get in, you're going to give yourself some energy, and then when you have enough, use Dispensary. From here, you place your 2 on any important things, typically like yourself and a defense target, or optionally, if there's no defense target, you can put it on your Sentinel like that. After that, you start getting your stack up by first triggering Arcane Fury. So now we have Arcane Fury, and then what we can do is we can place our 4 down, and then we can hit our wall from the outside, and that'll get our stack a bunch of damage. Basically, you just keep this active for the rest of the mission, and you keep getting your stacks up, and you'll be able to just blender everything. So moving on to a Steel Path Hydron. Basically, I just wanted to show that I can defend really well while also being able to do a bunch of damage. And basically, right here, I'm just going to show that she just turns into an absolute blender. Even against super, armored targets, it's just not a problem. You can just clean enemies right up by just simply walking into them once you have enough stacks. From here, I go into an Acolyte fight, and this is pretty straightforward. I just freeze everything, and then the Acolyte comes, and I just shoot him a couple times, even though I do pretty much no damage. But my stack, it does a lot. And they're just not even able to do anything. Not to mention he's blinded from my passive, so that's even better. Let's see another Acolyte really quick. So this one spawns below me, and I actually lost my stack, so I'm at only a mil right now, not even. And I do just about as much damage as when I had 2 mil, because as you can see, I put my 2 on him, which increases, how much damage he takes, and I have it on my Sentinel, so he's taking 2 ticks at a time. It definitely does good. And on top of that, I'm just incredibly tanky. Like, they can hit me and I still don't get one-shot, and they have a history of just one-shotting things. So that's pretty much how that goes. Moving on to my second build, which is Glass Guardian 2. This is just an alternative build to my first Glass Guardian. Typically, if you can't afford to stay stationary with Dispensary, or if you just don't have it. It sacrifices some stats, but it still works fine. It utilizes Mending Splinters to get some passive healing as well. In terms of helmet, you're going to want anything you can get your hands on, whether it's Roar for bonus damage or something like Pillage for added survivability and some armor strip. Almost anything is better than Spectre Rage in higher levels. Do whatever you like. I use an Umbra Forma, but you can get away without one, no problem. There's really no difference. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 3 Forma. You'll want 1 on the Aura. I recommend a Matter Eye or even an Aura Forma if you want to do other things. Additionally, you'll need to add 2 Nariman, one of which will replace a default Matter Eye. In terms of mods, I'm using Steel Charge here just because it gives bonus damage for things like Splinter Storm and Mass Vitrify. Next, I have Continuity because we want to bring up our duration as much as possible. We're pushing 44 seconds with this build. 45 actually. Next, we have Umbra Intensify to push our strength. This is pretty much the only way that we're getting strength as well as power drift, so definitely need that. For more duration, we have Augur Message and Constitution. This is good for faster knockdown recovery. This is always huge if you're not resisting knockdowns. That definitely helps, and of course for the extra duration. Prime Flow, because I really don't like running fleeting, and this kind of just helps with that. With everything costing more, at least you can have more in reserve, which goes pretty well with Energize. Mending Splinters, so we can just have a small heal on our targets. It's not huge, especially compared to the other Glass Guardian build, because you don't have Dispensary, but it is what it is. Next, we have Stretch, just so we don't have base range. And next we have Streamline to help our efficiency a bit. Lastly, we have Power Drift. This just pushes our strength a little bit more. In terms of Arcanes, you'll want Arcane Fury and either Arcane Guardian or Energize. Arcane Fury buffs your Vitrify explosion damage, which also gives your Splinter Storm more damage when stacking it this way. Guardian is a bit of an added tankiness and makes your wall stronger, but you may want Energize to help with your energy on this build. In terms of misc requirements, just run something that can crit for Arcane Fury. You'll want a melee that has nothing but damage mods on it. This is going to be a total stat stick. Keep in mind there are some weapons that have Syndicate Augments that add a good amount of damage. Basically, just stack as much damage mods as possible. And for the last slot, you can run Corrupt Charge, which will get you more damage than a 90 mod. Just remember that if you stack Puncture or Slash, only do one or the other, as one part of your first ability does only Puncture and the other Slash, so you won't get bonus damage for both. In terms of Operator School, Xenuric for the initial energy is a good option, but Vazarin has super good additional utility for longer missions, so you can make targets invulnerable and have some instant revives. I would do a quick how to use and show some gameplay, but I already have this in the previous build towards the end, so just refer to that. The only difference would be the fact that you don't have dispensary, so you can ignore that part. Okay, moving on to the third build, we have my Blender Tank build. This build is designed to take almost no damage while being able to put out good damage. In a way, it's a tanky alternate to the other builds, but in most cases, it's not needed. In terms of helmet, you're going to want something like Pillage or something that can help mitigate more damage. Pillage has the added bonus of removing some armor and keeping the shield gate up, so I prefer that. A lot of our damage reduction that we will have work on shields, so that's good. I use an Umbra Forma, but you can get away without one no problem. There's really no difference. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 5 Forma. You'll want 1 on the Aura. I recommend a Maturite or even an Ore Forma if you want to do other things. Additionally, you'll need to add 3 Nariman, one of which will replace the default Maturite, and 1 Xenuric on the Exilis. In terms of mods, starting with the Aura, we're going to be using Steel Charge just to boost our damage on our 4. This will also increase how much damage we can stack per cast on our Splinter Storm, so it's pretty important. Moving into the mods, we have Prime Continuity to bring our duration up quite a bit. Next, we have Umbra Intensify and Vitality to work together. We want some tank and we want some strength, and that's the best way to get it. If you actually have Pillage, instead of Vitality, you could use something like Prime Sure-Footed if you really wanted to. You may still die to Toxin attacks because of it, but you have a ton of damage resist on your shields alone, so Vitality may not be needed. Just keep in mind that this will also bring down your strength a tiny bit. Next, we have Flow, so we can bank a ton of energy. We really only need to be casting our 4 and 1 every so often. So we don't really need like a ton of energy, which is why I'm only running Streamline here, because it's, not that important. We have Constitution to bring up our duration, and we have Adaptation, so we can just stack as much damage mitigation as we possibly can. We're already getting a 90% damage reduction from our Splinter Storm, so having another 90% from Adaptation is pretty good. And Adaptation also works on shields from Pillage as well as the Splinter Storm damage reduction. So you're getting a lot of damage reduction for your shields. Next we have Streamline. This is kind of an option slot. You can replace this with, whatever you want. Of course, that'll change what Forma you need there. Next we have Stretch, and just so we're not, running around with a base range Splinter Storm, and so our Master Vitrify hits a little bit further. This also doubles pretty well for Pillage. Lastly, we have Power Drift just to push our strength a little bit further. And in terms of Arcanes, you'll want Arcane Guardian and Arcane Fury. The reason we don't want Energize here is because it's not a primary focus. We stack damage on our second ability, and in between our 4 recast we are killing, so we get enough energy back. In terms of misc requirements, just run something that can crit for Arcane Fury. You'll want a melee that has nothing but damage mods on it. This is going to be a total stat stick. Keep in mind there are some weapons that have Syndicate Augments that add a good amount of damage. Basically, just stack as much damage mods as possible. And for the last slot, you can run Corrupt Charge, which will get you more damage than a 90 mod. Just remember that if you stack Puncture or Slash, only do one or the other, as one part of your first ability does only Puncture and the other Slash, so you won't get bonus damage for both. In terms of Operator School, Xenuric for the initial energy is a good option, but Vazarin has super good additional utility for longer missions, so you can make targets invulnerable and have some instant revives. So, in terms of how to play, this build doesn't play much differently than the other builds. However, the only difference this time is that I can use Pillage, and I'm now extremely tanky. As you can see, that is pretty strong. These are 185 Lancers. That is a lot. And I can just sit here and take it. There's not many frames that can just do this. It took so long that they ended up just walking away. So when you combine that with the fact that you can get a pretty high damage stack with your 2, you can just Get that going. Now I'm at 33k, which isn't too bad. You want to be making sure that you get your crit with Arcane Fury, otherwise, you know, it won't be nearly as much. Now I'm going to go into some gameplay. So here I loaded up a Steel Path Survival. So the first thing you want to do is obviously give yourself some energy, and then you're going to put Splinter Storm on you and your Sentinel, assuming you're running one. Once that's done, I like to hit Pillage just to have the extra shields. And then I cast 4. And then as soon as I get enough energy to start stacking my damage, I do that, I break it, and then all that damage goes into that. I forgot to use Arcane Fury. I actually don't think I used Arcane Fury throughout the most of this video, but it's fine. So we move on here. You know, you just keep stacking. I'm at 2.5 mil now in this one. And the Acolyte shows up, and as you can see, when I'm actually next to him, it just absolutely melts him. I kind of got jumpy, and I wasn't around him the whole time. Like, I don't know why I was shooting him here. But when I'm right next to him like that, the Sentinel and, you know, my Splinter Storm hits him really hard, and he just doesn't even have a chance to do any damage to me. Here I go through this hallway that you can see is just, it blends the entire hallway. It's so good. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So that is the complete Gara guide. Gara is a top tier frame that can do damage and mitigate damage really well. Definitely one of the staple defenders in the game. If you enjoyed the video or helped in any way, please leave a like. And if you're looking forward to future content like this, subscribe and stay tuned. If I missed anything, or you'd like to leave some feedback, leave it down in the comments. I appreciate all the support, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.